The sun crept over the horizon, its rays struggling to penetrate the smoggy skies of Lagos. 12-year-old Bummy stirred in her narrow bed as the rhythmic sound of her mother pounding yam outside their tiny one-room apartment reached her ears. She opened her eyes to the sight of the cracked ceiling above, a silent reminder of their life in the cramped face me, I face you compound. "Bummy, wake up!" Her mother's voice, sharp but loving, echoed through the room. "Do you want to make me late for the market?" Bummy groaned and stretched, her petite frame still cocooned in a faded wrapper. "Mama, it's not even light yet," she mumbled, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Iyabo, her mother, entered the room, her hands dusted with yam flour. She was a wiry woman with tired eyes that still held traces of beauty. "Light or no light, customers are waiting for me at Balogun Market. And you, young lady, have a school to attend. Now sweep this floor and fetch water before you eat." "Yes, Mama," Bummy replied, quickly grabbing the broom. The compound was alive with the sounds of mourning, buckets clanking against taps, children crying, and neighbors shouting over trivial disputes. As Bummy swept, Mama Adebayo, their loud-mouthed neighbor, called out from her doorway, "Iyabo, this your daughter is a blessing. If my boys had half her discipline, I wouldn't be shouting every morning." Bummy smiled faintly. She enjoyed the compliments, but never let them get to her head. "Mama Adebayo, maybe they just need a better teacher," she teased back, earning a chuckle. Iyabo, balancing a basket of yams on her head, paused to address Bummy. "I will be back late. Don't waste time playing after school. I left some soup in the pot for you." "Yes, Mama." "Be safe," Bummy said, watching as her mother disappeared into the chaotic streets. At school, Bummy shone brightly. Despite wearing second-hand uniforms and walking to school barefoot most days, she never let her circumstances dull her enthusiasm for learning. Her teacher, Mr. Lawal, often used her as an example to motivate the class. "Class, you see Bummy? She comes early, does her homework, and listens in class. Poverty is not an excuse for laziness," he said one day, pointing to her. Bummy felt her cheeks flush, but she managed a shy smile. She loved school, not just because she excelled, but because it offered her a brief escape from the struggles at home. Life in the slum was a constant reminder of what Bummy and her mother lacked. Yet it was their reality, and they faced it with quiet resilience. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at school, Bummy returned home to find her mother sitting quietly in their room. Her yam basket was untouched, and her usually lively eyes seemed clouded with worry. "Mama, why didn't you go to the market today?" Bummy asked, setting down her school bag. Iyabo sighed heavily. "I wasn't feeling strong. Besides, I ran into someone who ruined my appetite for work." "Who, Mama?" Iyabo hesitated, her lips tightening. Then, with a deep breath, she said, "Your father." Bummy froze. She had heard stories of the man who had abandoned them the moment she was born, but she had never met him. Her mother rarely spoke about him, and Bummy had learned not to ask. He was at the bus stop near the market. Looking as irresponsible as ever, Iyabo continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He had the nerve to call out to me asking for forgiveness." "What did you do?" Bummy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I walked away," Iyabo replied firmly. "That man is dead to me." Bummy swallowed hard, unsure how to process the information. A part of her wanted to meet the man who had given her life, but another part of her hated him for leaving them to struggle alone. Weeks passed, and Ayabo's health began to deteriorate. She insisted it was just the stress of work, but Bummy noticed the way her mother's hands trembled and how she struggled to catch her breath. One night, as they sat outside their room eating the modest meal Bummy had prepared, she finally voiced her concern. "Mama, you need to see a doctor. You're coughing more than before." Iyabo waved her off. "Doctors cost money, Bummy, money we don't have. Besides, it's just the dust from the market." "But what if it's something serious?" Bummy pressed. Iyabo reached out and took her daughter's hand. "Listen to me, my child. Life is not easy, but we do what we can. I've done my best to give you a chance at a better future. Promise me you'll keep studying hard no matter what happens." Tears welled up in Bummy's eyes. "Don't say things like that, Mama. You'll be fine." But the following week, Ayabo's condition worsened. One night, Bummy woke to the sound of her mother gasping for air. Panic gripped her as she screamed for help. "Mama, stay with me, please." Neighbors rushed in, trying to help, but there was little they could do. By morning, Iyabo was gone. Bummy sat in the corner of their room, clutching her mother's wrapper as tears streamed down her face. The neighbors murmured around her, their voices heavy with pity. What will happen to her now? She's just a child. How will she survive? Bummy wiped her tears, determination hardening her features. Her mother had fought tirelessly to give her a chance, and she would not let that effort go to waste. I will survive, Mama, she whispered to herself. I promise it'll make you proud. The day after Iabo's burial, the small apartment was filled with relatives who had come to pay their respects. Bummy sat in the corner, clutching a framed photo of her mother, her eyes hollow from crying. She barely noticed the murmured conversations or the occasional glances cast her way. In the middle of the room, her mother's only sister, Aunt Ife, sat stiffly, her face a mask of sorrow that barely concealed the anxiety underneath. She was a petite woman with sharp features, her wrapper tied loosely around her waist. An older uncle, Baba Sule, cleared his throat, signaling the start of the family meeting. We all know why we're here, he began, his deep voice commanding attention. Iabo is gone, and we must decide what to do with her daughter. There was a murmur of agreement around the room. Aunt Ife shifted in her seat. Bummy is a smart child, no doubt, but raising another child is not easy. I have 5 of my own, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. Resources are tight. Baba Sule raised a hand to silence her. Sister Ife, you're the only female sibling. You'll understand her needs better than any of us. Besides, you and Iabo were close. It makes sense for you to take her in. Aunt Ife opened her mouth to protest, but another relative, Uncle Kola, cut in. It's not just about closeness. Iabo trusted you the most. She would want Bummy to stay with you. That's true, another voice added, and as her aunt, you'll connect with her in ways we cannot. Bummy watched silently as the conversation unfolded, her small hands tightening around the photo frame. Aunt Ife sighed, her shoulders slumping. I understand what you're saying, but my situation is not easy. My husband, well, you all know how he is. Adding another child will be a burden. Baba Sule leaned forward, his tone firm. Burden or not, this is family. We cannot abandon her. Ife, you must take her. It's the right thing to do. The room fell silent as Aunt Ife pressed her lips together, clearly unhappy but outnumbered. Finally, she nodded. Fine, I will take her. Bummy's heart sank. She didn't know much about Aunt Ife, but the woman's reluctance was palpable. Later that evening, as the relatives trickled out, Aunt Ife approached Bummy, her expression unreadable. Pack your things. We're leaving tomorrow. Yes, Ma, Bummy replied softly. As Ife walked away, her thoughts churned. Another mouth to feed. Another child to clothe and care for. I can barely manage the ones I have, and now this. The journey to Ogun State was long and uncomfortable. Bummy sat quietly in the back of the bus, clutching the small bag of belongings she had managed to pack. Aunt Ife barely spoke to her, her attention focused on the road ahead. When they arrived at the small, self-contained home, Bummy was greeted by the sight of 5 children, all under the age of 10, running around noisily. Inside, the house was cramped with barely enough space for the family, let alone a new addition. This is where you'll sleep, Aunt Ife said curtly, pointing to a worn mat in the corner of the living room. Bummy nodded, her heart sinking further. That night, as the children squabbled over dinner, Bummy tried to make herself useful. Auntie, should I help serve the food? She offered timidly. Ife looked at her, her expression cold. Just sit down. You'll eat what's left after my children are done. Bummy swallowed her hurt and nodded. The days that followed were filled with endless chores. Aunt Ife seemed determined to keep Bummy busy from dawn till dusk. Bummy, sweep the compound. Wash the plates. Go and fetch water from the well. No matter how hard she worked, nothing seemed to satisfy her aunt. You call this clean? Ife snapped one afternoon, pointing to a patch of dirt on the floor. Do it again. Yes, Ma, Bummy replied, her voice trembling. At night, Bummy lay on her mat, her body aching from the day's labor. She stared at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her face. She missed her mother terribly, the warmth of her love, the way she made even the hardest days bearable. One evening, Ife's husband stumbled in, reeking of alcohol. He barely acknowledged Bummy, muttering something unintelligible as he collapsed onto the sofa. Who is that? He slurred, pointing a finger in Bummy's direction. Shezayabo's daughter, Ife replied flatly. He grunted. Another burden. Don't let her eat too much. Bummy's face burned with humiliation. but she kept quiet. Weeks turned into months, and the pattern continued. Bummy worked tirelessly, enduring her aunt's sharp words and the cold indifference of her uncle. The other children, sensing their mother's disdain for Bummy, treated her like an outsider. One afternoon, as Bummy scrubbed clothes in the yard, Aunt Ife stood watching her, arms crossed. "You think life is easy?" she said, her tone harsh. "Your mother spoiled you with dreams, but here you'll learn the truth. Nobody owes you anything." Bummy looked up, her hands raw from scrubbing. "I'm trying my best, Auntie." "Try harder," Ive snapped before walking away. That night, as Bummy lay on her mat, she whispered to herself, "Mama, if you can hear me, please give me strength. I don't know how much more I can take." But deep in her heart, she resolved not to give up. If her mother had taught her anything, it was to fight, no matter how hard life became. The small room was dark and silent, save for the soft sobs coming from Bummy's corner. She clutched her knees to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks as her muffled cries escaped her lips. "Why did you leave me, Mama?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did you leave me in this cruel world?" The house was still, her aunt and cousins already asleep. Outside, the faint sound of crickets filled the air, mocking her loneliness. Every night felt heavier than the last, a new weight pressing down on her young shoulders. She thought of her mother's warm embrace, the gentle way she stroked her hair when she was upset, and her encouraging words, "Bummy, you're stronger than you think. You can face anything." But here, in this unforgiving place, strength felt impossible to muster. The next morning, Aunt Ife's voice jolted Bummy from her restless sleep. "Bummy, get up, lazy girl!" Bummy scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She hadn't yet finished her morning chores, and she knew better than to test her aunt's patience. "Come here," Ife ordered as Bummy entered the kitchen, where her aunt was tying a tray filled with oranges and ground nuts. "You're old enough to contribute to this house. My children go to school because they're my responsibility. You, on the other hand, need to earn your keep." "But Auntie," Bummy started, her voice trembling, "I want to go to school too. Mama always said." "Your mother isn't here." Ife snapped, her face hard. "This isn't Lagos where you could dream big. Here, you do what I say. Now take this tray and make sure you sell everything before you come home, or else." Bummy's lips quivered, but she nodded silently, knowing resistance was futile. She balanced the heavy tray on her head and made her way out of the cramped house, her heart heavy with despair. The streets of the village were bustling with life. Bummy moved through the crowds, her small voice calling out, "Oranges and ground nuts! Fresh oranges!" Her feet ached and the sun beat down on her mercilessly, but she continued, driven by the fear of returning home with unsold goods. Some days were better than others, but more often than not, people would haggle her down to almost nothing or refuse to buy altogether. "Little girl, these oranges are too expensive," a woman scoffed. "But Ma, it's the same price as everyone else's," Bummy pleaded. The woman waved her off. "Then he'll buy from someone else." By the time the sun began to set, Bummy had only sold half her tray. She walked home slowly, dreading the punishment that awaited her. As soon as she stepped inside, Aunt Ife's sharp voice rang out. "You're just coming back and with unsold goods?" "I tried, Auntie," Bummy stammered. "People didn't want to buy." "Tried? Tried?" Ife stormed towards her, yanking the tray off her head. "Your trying isn't good enough? Do you think food grows on trees?" Before Bummy could respond, her aunt's hand lashed out, striking her across the face. The pain stung, but the humiliation hurt even more. "You won't eat tonight," Ife declared. "Maybe hunger will teach you to be serious." Later that night, as Bummy scrubbed the floors on her knees as part of her punishment, her cousins sat nearby, laughing and eating. "Why don't you just sell everything faster?" one of them taunted, a boy not much older than Bummy. "Then you wouldn't get into trouble." "I'm doing my best," Bummy replied quietly, keeping her eyes on the floor. "Well, your best isn't good enough," another cousin added, smirking. Days turned into weeks, and the routine became unbearable. Wake up before dawn, do chores, hawk in the scorching sun, and face her aunt's wrath if she didn't meet expectations. The beatings and punishments came so often that Bummy began to lose track of the days. Yet, even in her darkest moments, she clung to hope. As she walked the streets with her tray, she often passed children in school uniforms, their laughter a painful reminder of what she had lost. One day, as she sat under a tree to rest, she whispered to herself, "Mama, I will find a way out of this." I don't know how, but I will. And with that small, quiet vow, a spark of determination flickered in her heart. The days crawled by like years in Aunt Aoife's cramped home, each one heavier with suffering than the last. Bummy woke before dawn every morning, her small frame bent under the weight of chores and hawking. Her dreams of education and a better life faded with every beating and insult hurled her way. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the dusty floor of the living room, the sound of loud laughter erupted outside. Moments later, the door swung open, and Aunt Aoife's closest friend, Bisi, strutted in. Aunt Aoife! Look at you, Bisi exclaimed, her voice filled with exaggerated warmth. She was a tall, bold woman with brightly painted nails and a headscarf tied neatly around her head. I just said let me stop by and check on my dear friend. You're welcome, Bisi, Aoife replied, smiling for the first time in days. She dusted her wrapper and gestured for Bisi to sit. What will you take? Water? Gary? No need, my friend. I'm fine. Bisi's eyes scanned the room, landing on Bummy crouched in the corner, scrubbing with a rag. Who is that? That's Iabo's daughter, Aoife said with a dismissive wave of her hand. The one I told you about. Oh, so this is the famous niece. Bisi leaned closer, inspecting Bummy. She looks strong for her age. Strong, yes, Aoife muttered, but more trouble than she's worth. Always giving me one headache or another. If not for family, I wouldn't have agreed to take her in. Bisi smirked. Well, it's not too late to make her useful. What do you mean? Aoife asked, intrigued. Bisi leaned back, her tone conspiratorial. I know someone in Lagos who's looking for housemaids. They pay 10,000 naira a month. Steady money, no stress. Let her go and work. That way you won't have to deal with her anymore, and you can even use the money to take care of your own children. Aoife's eyes lit up. 10,000? Every month? Every month, Bisi confirmed, nodding, and you won't have to see her face every day. It's a win-win. That evening, after Bisi left, Aoife sat in her room, turning the idea over in her mind. The thought of getting rid of Bummy and earning money in the process was too tempting to ignore. She called her husband, who was half drunk as usual, to discuss it. Housemaid? He slurred, scratching his head. Let her go. Less wahala for us. It's settled then, Aoife said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. The next morning, Aoife called Bummy into the living room. The girl stood nervously, her hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Auntie? I've found a solution to your laziness, Aoife announced, her tone sharp. You're going to Lagos to work as a housemaid. They'll pay 10,000 naira a month, and maybe then you'll learn some responsibility. Bummy's heart sank. But Auntie, I don't want to leave. I can work harder here. Enough, Aoife snapped. Do you think this is up for discussion? You'll go, and that's final. Start packing your things. You leave in 2 weeks. Bummy nodded silently, tears welling in her eyes. The following days were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Bummy didn't know what to expect from this new chapter of her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being sent away to endure even more suffering. On the morning of her departure, Bisi arrived to escort her to the house in Lagos. She looked Bummy up and down, shaking her head. You'll need to toughen up if you're going to survive there, she said bluntly. As they left, Bummy glanced back at the small house one last time. Despite everything, it had been the only home she had known since her mother's death. Now she was stepping into the unknown, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. In the bus to Lagos, Bisi tried to make conversation, but Bummy barely responded. She stared out the window, watching the landscape change, her thoughts consumed by what lay ahead. Listen, girl, Bisi said, her tone firm. This is a good opportunity for you. Don't mess it up. Be obedient, work hard, and maybe your employers will treat you well. Yes, Ma, Bummy replied quietly. As they approached the bustling city, Bummy's mind raced with questions. What will my new life be like? Will they treat me kindly? Will I ever see my mother's dreams for me come true? She clutched her small bag tightly, bracing herself for whatever lay ahead. The house where Bummy was brought to serve as a housemaid stood proudly at the end of a quiet street in Surulere. It was a modest, cream-colored bungalow with a neat garden at the front, vibrant flowers lining the pathway. To anyone passing by, the house looked like a beacon of comfort and order, a far cry from the chaos and poverty of Aunt Aoife's home. This is where you'll be staying, Bisi said, nudging Bummy forward as they approached the gate. Be respectful and do what they ask. Don't embarrass me. Yes, Ma, Bummy murmured, her eyes scanning the house nervously. The gate opened, revealing a stern-looking man in his 40s. He had sharp features and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a short-sleeved shirt tucked into well-pressed trousers. "You must be the new girl," he said, his tone curt. "I'm Mr. Musa. Welcome. Come in." Bummy followed him into the house, clutching her small bag tightly. Inside, the living room was tidy and tastefully decorated. The furniture was simple but elegant, the air smelling faintly of lemon polish. A woman emerged from the hallway. Mrs. Musa. She was tall and graceful, wearing a plain but immaculate dress. Her expression was unreadable as her sharp eyes landed on Bummy. "So this is the girl?" Mrs. Musa asked, addressing Bisi. "Yes, ma," Bisi replied with a nervous smile. "She's hard-working and well-mannered. She'll do everything you ask." "I hope so," Mrs. Musa said coolly. She turned to Bummy. "Listen, young lady, this house runs on rules. You will wake up by 4:30 a.m. every day to start your chores, and you will not stop until everything is spotless. No idle chatter, no mistakes. If you follow the rules, we'll get along fine. If not," she let the unspoken threat linger. "Yes, ma," Bummy said, her voice barely audible. The first few days were grueling. The Musa household, though beautiful, felt more like a prison than a home. Bummy's tasks seemed endless, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, cooking meals, and cleaning the windows until they gleamed. "Bummy!" Mrs. Musa's voice rang out one morning. "You missed a spot on the floor. Do it again." Bummy dropped to her knees, scrubbing furiously, her arms aching. The Musa children, 2 teenage boys and a girl of about 8, were no kinder. "House girl, fetch me water," the youngest one demanded, pointing to the dining table. "Get it yourself," Bummy muttered under her breath. "What did you say?" the girl snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Nothing, ma," Bummy quickly corrected, rushing to obey. The evenings were no better. While the family ate dinner together, Bummy was relegated to the small kitchen, where she picked at leftover scraps. She often ate in silence, tears pooling in her eyes as she thought about her mother. "Is this my life now, Mama?" she whispered one night. "Is this what you wanted for me?" One weekend, Mr. Musa decided to test her cooking skills. "Today, you'll make egusi soup," he announced. "Yes, sir," Bummy replied, hiding her nervousness. She had helped her mother cook many times before, but the pressure of perfection weighed on her. When the meal was ready, she set the table, her heart pounding as the family sat down to eat. "This is too salty." Mr. Musa barked after his first bite. "I'm sorry, sir. It'll do better next time," Bummy stammered. "There shouldn't be a next time for mistakes," Mrs. Musa added coldly. "You need to focus. You're here to work, not to waste our resources." The days blurred together, each one harsher than the last. The Musa family's rigid discipline and constant criticism made life unbearable. Bummy was exhausted, lonely, and often wondered if she had truly left Aunt Ife's house, or if she had merely traded one kind of suffering for another. One night, as she lay on the thin mattress in the small storeroom they had assigned to her, she stared at the ceiling, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Is this all I'm worth?" she thought. "Just someone to scrub and serve?" But even in her despair, a tiny spark of resilience burned within her. "This can't be the end of my story." The memories of the Musa household were a mix of grueling labor and harsh words, but one stood out, sharp and clear, like a wound that refused to heal. It was a bright Saturday morning when the Musa family prepared for an outing. The excitement was palpable in the air as the children rushed around the house, trying on clothes and shouting about the fun they were going to have. "Mama, can I wear my new sneakers?" The youngest daughter, Fatima, asked, holding up the pristine white shoes. "Yes, but be careful not to dirty them," Mrs. Musa replied as she packed a cooler with food and drinks. Bummy watched from the corner of the kitchen where she was scrubbing pots. Her heart ached with longing as she saw the children's excitement. She hadn't been out for anything fun since her mother's death. "Bummy," Mrs. Musa called sharply, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Yes, ma," Bummy replied, rushing to her. "Clean up the kitchen before we leave and make sure the house is spotless by the time we return," she said without looking at her. "Yes, ma," Bummy said, her voice trembling. The family piled into the car, laughing and chatting. As they drove off, the sound of their joy fading into the distance, Bummy stood at the door, clutching the rag in her hands. She felt invisible, a shadow in the background of their lives. Hours later, the family returned, their voices louder and their laughter more boisterous. The children carried balloons and party hats, their faces smeared with remnants of ice cream. It was so much fun. Fatima exclaimed as she ran into the living room. "Did you see the fireworks, Baba?" The older boy Abdul added. Yes, Mr. Musa said, smiling. It was a good outing. Bummy stepped forward to take the cooler from Mrs. Musa, her eyes lingering on the unopened packs of food and drinks inside. Her stomach growled, but she quickly averted her gaze, knowing better than to ask. "Bummy, take this to the kitchen and wash everything," Mrs. Musa said curtly, handing her the empty plates. "Yes, Ma," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, as the family sat in the living room, recounting their day, Bummy hovered near the kitchen door, listening. "The roller coaster was the best part," Abdul said, laughing. "And the food. Oh, that jollof rice and chicken was amazing," Fatima added. Bummy's throat tightened as she listened to their happy chatter. She had scrubbed their plates clean, the scent of the leftover food teasing her hunger. She hadn't eaten all day, save for a few crumbs she had scavenged from the kitchen counter. Later, as she lay on her thin mattress in the storeroom, tears streamed down her face. The exclusion cut deeper than the harsh words or the endless chores. For the first time, she truly felt what it meant to be alone in the world. "Why, Mama?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why did you leave me in this cruel place?" The memory of that day stayed with her, a painful reminder of her position in the Musa household. She was there to serve, to be unseen and unheard. But even as the pain lingered, so did her resolve. She promised herself that one day she would no longer be on the outside looking in. One day, it'll matter too. The Musa household had stripped Bummy of every shred of dignity she had left. Day after day, she endured the relentless cycle of work, insults, and neglect. What started as silent tears at night turned into a cold numbness that filled her heart. It was an ordinary Tuesday when everything came crashing down. "Bummy!" Mrs. Moo's sharp voice pierced through the air. Bummy, already drenched in sweat from scrubbing the bathroom floor, ran to the kitchen where Mrs. Musa stood holding a bowl of burnt stew. "Are you trying to poison us?" Mrs. Musa spat, shoving the bowl toward her. "You think this is food? You call this stew?" "I'm sorry, Ma," Bummy said, her hands trembling. "It was on the stove for too long. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to? You useless girl." Mrs. Musa's hand connected with Bummy's cheek, the sting of the slap sending her stumbling backward. The children laughed as they watched the scene unfold. "Housegirl doesn't even know how to cook properly," Abdul sneered. "Maybe she should eat the burnt stew herself," Fatima added, giggling. Bummy swallowed hard, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Later that day, as she cleaned the living room, Mr. Musa's voice boomed from the hallway. "Bummy, get in here!" She hurried to him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Look at this shirt," he barked, holding up a neatly ironed white shirt with a tiny wrinkle near the collar. "You call this ironing? Are you blind?" "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he growled. "Iron it again, and if I see one more mistake, you'll regret it." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Bummy's stomach growled painfully. She had not eaten all day, as punishment for the burnt stew. She stood by the dining room door, watching as they devoured the food she had prepared. "Bummy!" Fatima called out, her voice filled with mockery. "Fetch me water!" "Yes, Ma," Bummy replied, walking to the kitchen with heavy feet. As she poured the water, tears streamed down her face. The hunger, the exhaustion, the humiliation, it was all too much. When she returned to the dining room, Fatima smirked and said, "You look like you're going to cry. Are we too much for you, housegirl?" The family erupted in laughter, their voices like nails on a chalkboard. Bummy clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned and walked back to the kitchen, her mind racing. That night, as she lay on her mattress, staring at the ceiling, something inside her broke. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to herself. "They treat me like an animal, like I don't matter, like I'm nothing." Her thoughts turned dark as she recalled every insult, every slap, every moment of starvation. The anger that had been simmering inside her for months finally bubbled over. "They need to feel what it's like to suffer," she thought. "To hurt the way they've hurt me." Her eyes landed on the small shelf in the kitchen where the rat poison was kept. It was a simple, unassuming packet, but its presence loomed large in her mind. The next morning, as she prepared breakfast for the family, she stood at the counter, holding the packet of rat poison in her hands. Her heart raced as she contemplated her decision. This will end it all, she thought. No more pain, no more humiliation. But as she stared at the packet, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Bummy, my girl, no matter what life throws at you, never lose your heart. Stay strong, stay kind. Her hands trembled and tears streamed down her face. She dropped the packet onto the counter and sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't, she whispered. I can't do it. That day, Bummy worked harder than ever, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion. But her heart was heavy with despair. She knew she couldn't stay in the Musa household much longer. As the sun set and the family retreated to their rooms, Bummy sat on the kitchen floor, clutching her knees to her chest. God, if you're there, please help me, she prayed. Show me a way out of this. I can't take it anymore. In the silence of the night, she made a promise to herself. She would find a way to escape this life, no matter what it took. The Musa household bustled with its usual demands that morning, but Bummy was numb to it all. Weeks of torment had turned her into someone she barely recognized. Her decision was no longer a flicker of anger, but a cold, calculated resolve. As the family barked orders from the dining room, Bummy worked quietly in the kitchen. She prepared their favorite jollof rice and fried chicken, the scent wafting through the house. This is it, she whispered to herself, her hands trembling. Her eyes landed on the packet of rat poison she had hidden under the sink. She hesitated for a moment, her mind replaying every insult, every slap, every moment of starvation. They deserve it, she muttered, her voice filled with bitterness. Opening the packet, she poured the fine white powder into the steaming pot of rice, stirring it until it dissolved completely. Bummy, is the food ready? Mrs. Musa's sharp voice rang out. Yes, Ma, Bummy replied, carrying the tray to the dining room. The family dug in with relish, complimenting the meal as they ate. This is delicious, Mr. Musa said, taking another bite. Bummy, you actually did something right for once, Mrs. Musa remarked, her tone still laced with disdain. Bummy stood silently by the doorway, watching as they devoured the poisoned food. A cold, hollow feeling settled in her chest. Hours later, the house grew eerily quiet. One by one, the family members began to feel unwell. Mr. Musa clutched his stomach, groaning in pain. What is this? He gasped, collapsing onto the floor. Abdul, call the doctor, Mrs. Musa managed to say before she too fell to the ground. The children cried out, their voices filled with terror as the poison took its toll. Bummy watched from the kitchen, frozen in place. Help! Fatima whispered weakly before her small body went limp. By nightfall, the house was silent. The next morning, the gateman Musa noticed something was off. The usual hustle and bustle of the family were absent. Concerned, he knocked on the front door. Madam, is everything okay? He called out. There was no response. Summoning his courage, he opened the door and stepped inside. The sight that greeted him froze him in his tracks. The family lay scattered across the living room and dining area, lifeless. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the table, the aroma now sickening. Blood of Jesus, Musa exclaimed, stumbling backward. Grabbing his phone, he called the police. Please come quickly. Something terrible has happened here. When the police arrived, the scene was somber. Officers surveyed the lifeless bodies, their expressions grim. Who else lives here? One officer asked. The house girl, Musa said, pointing toward the kitchen. They found Bummy sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her face expressionless. Did you do this? The officer asked, his voice firm but gentle. Bummy didn't respond. She simply stared at the ground, her mind numb. At the police station, Bummy was questioned. Human Rights and Child Protection Services were immediately involved, their representatives horrified by her young age and the situation she had endured. She's only 14, one of the advocates said, her voice filled with sorrow. What could drive a child to this point? She needs counseling, not punishment, another added. The officers recorded her statement, piecing together the events that led to the tragedy. Bummy sat in the interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in years, she felt something other than anger or despair. It was regret. I didn't want this, she whispered to herself. I just wanted it to stop. As the sun set over the police station, Bummy's future hung in the balance. She was no longer just a house girl or a victim of abuse. She was now a girl who had crossed a line, her life forever changed. The courtroom was silent as the judge read Bummy's sentence. Considering the circumstances surrounding this case, including the abuse and neglect endured by the defendant, the court has decided on a corrective rather than punitive measure. Omobumi Olajide is hereby sentenced to 5 years of community service at a juvenile rehabilitation center. She will also receive mandatory counseling and mentorship programs. The gavel struck and the room erupted in murmurs. Bummy stood still, her frail frame trembling as tears streamed down her face. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it still felt like a mountain to climb. Her days in community service were grueling. Bummy worked in orphanages, cleaned public spaces, and assisted in soup kitchens. The tasks were physically demanding, but they slowly chipped away at the wall she had built around her heart. It was during one of these service days that an NGO worker, Mrs. Ajayi, noticed her. "Who's that girl?" she asked one of the supervisors. "That's Bummy," the supervisor replied. "She's been through a lot. Her story is heartbreaking." That evening, as Bummy sat under a tree during her break, Mrs. Ajayi approached her. "Hello, Bummy," she said with a warm smile. Bummy looked up, her guarded eyes meeting the older woman's compassionate gaze. "Hi," she replied softly. "I've heard about your story," Mrs. Ajayi continued, sitting beside her. "You've been through more than anyone your age should endure." Bummy looked away, her throat tightening. She didn't want pity. "I'm not here to pity you," Mrs. Ajayi added, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm here to help." Bummy turned back, her eyes narrowing. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Mrs. Ajayi said firmly. The next week, with permission from the authorities, the NGO took Bummy under their wing. She was enrolled in a reputable boarding school, where she received a scholarship covering her tuition and other expenses. For the first time in years, Bummy slept on a proper bed in a room of her own. Her meals were regular and filling, and her school uniform fit perfectly. At first, adjusting to her new life was difficult. The trauma of her past lingered, and she often felt out of place among her classmates. "Bummy, are you okay?" one of her teachers, Mrs. Johnson, asked during a lunch break. "I'm fine, Ma," Bummy replied, though her voice betrayed her unease. "You're doing well in your classes," Mrs. Johnson encouraged. "You're smart, and you have a bright future ahead of you." Bummy nodded, but the weight of her past was hard to shake off. The NGO didn't stop at providing her education. They also gave her a family. Mrs. Ajayi and her team treated Bummy like one of their own, celebrating her birthdays, attending her school events, and showering her with unconditional love. One evening, during a family-style dinner at the NGO's headquarters, Bummy looked around the table and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "For what?" asked Tunde, one of the staff members. "For everything," Bummy replied, tears streaming down her face. "For giving me a home, for believing in me." Over the years, Bummy blossomed. She excelled in her studies, participated in extracurricular activities, and even began mentoring younger children at the NGO. Her heart, once hardened by pain and anger, softened with each act of kindness she received and gave in return. By the time she completed her community service and graduated from secondary school, Bummy was no longer the broken girl who had arrived at the NGO. She was a strong, confident young woman with dreams of becoming a social worker to help children like herself. As she stood at her graduation ceremony, wearing her cap and gown, she looked out into the crowd and saw the smiling faces of her new family. "I made it," she whispered to herself, a mixture of pride and gratitude swelling in her chest. For the first time, she believed her mother's words: "No matter what life throws at you, never lose your heart. Stay strong, stay kind." Years later, Bummy stood before a room full of children at the NGO where she now worked as a social worker. Her voice, steady and warm, filled the room. "Pain doesn't define you," she told them. "It shapes you, yes, but it doesn't have to break you. If I could rise from the ashes of cruelty and loss, so can you. You are stronger than the world wants you to believe." As the children applauded, a tear slipped down her cheek, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had come. In that moment, Bummy realized her life was no longer a story of suffering. It was a story of survival, resilience, and the power of finding family in the unlikeliest of places.